Anxiety in action. Anger, frustration, overwhelm, despair. All natural emotional responses to climate change.
In this session, learn from Force of Nature founder of Clover Hogan about the rise of eco-anxiety, the role of mental health in activism, and how we can begin to channel difficult feelings into action.
So thank you girls for such a lovely introduction. That was very sweet. Brilliant to be joining for yet another day of the Youth Climate Summit. My name is Clover Hogan. I am a 21-year-old climate activist and the founder and executive director of Force of Nature, as you already mentioned. So we are a social enterprise that works with young people from around the world to really step up rather than shut down in the face of climate change. We also work with business leaders and policymakers to serve as a forum for intergenerational exchange. So really bringing together the energy of youth with the knowledge of experience. And so today we're really going to be talking about the problem excuse me, that we exist to take on a force of nature, which is that of powerlessness. So how we can actually step up rather than shut down in the face of climate change. And how we're going to do that is by jumping a little bit more into kind of climate psychology, understanding our mental and emotional landscapes in the context of climate change, that kind of thing. And so for a little bit of background, I've been researching this area of climate psychology for the past few years. I've been on the front lines of climate activism since I was 11 years old, and I became fascinated about midway through that journey with the idea that, you know, the threat even greater than climate change was just how powerless we felt in the face of it, and wanting to understand the role of mindset and being able to really take on these problems. And so today, that's really what we're going to dive into. And we're going to start by looking at a term that you all are probably quite familiar with, which is eco-anxiety. And we're also going to look at ecophobia, so specifically the feeling of powerlessness. And what we've learned at Force of Nature in researching these issues is that there are lots of influences out there that determine our ability to show up in here. Eco-anxiety relates to any feeling of grief or stress or anxiety or overwhelm in the face of climate change, and perfectly natural kind of responses to the state of the world, to, you know, feeling that the challenges are too great and that we're too small to take them on. Ecophobia is a close cousin to eco-anxiety, but a little bit different in that it relates specifically to the feeling of powerlessness. So looking at the feelings and what happens when we kind of don't have a clear sense of what we can do, a clear sense of agency, and how those feelings can then shut us down. So a lot of climate psychologists would argue that eco-anxiety is in fact, you know, a perfectly natural kind of human response to the climate crisis and ecological breakdown. And in fact, the problem isn't that lots of young people are experiencing eco-anxiety, but that not enough people are experiencing eco-anxiety. These feelings really show that we have high empathy, that we care about the issues. Research from Friends of the Earth last year showed that over 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds surveyed were actually experiencing eco-anxiety. And the same is reflected in our research at Force of Nature, which shows that upwards of 70% of young people fear that climate change has a negative impact on their mental health, and also creates a feeling of hopelessness. So what we're going to think about today is how to really channel those feelings in a positive way, and how to kind of keep them from tipping into that like hopelessness, or to a point where we feel that they're doing more harm than they are doing good to our mental health and our sense of agency to take action on climate change. So today I'm going to unpack the three kind of core causes of why we feel powerless in the face of these issues. It's going to be a whistle-stop tour before we jump into a quick activity, to really draw awareness to our stories and the stories that we subscribe to about the world that determine our ability to show up and take action. So the three core buckets of this powerlessness, or why we find it so difficult to take action on climate change relates to evolutionary psychology, cultural narrative, and finally self-limiting beliefs, which you can also think of as your kind of inner critics and gremlins. So for the first one, evolutionary psychology, this looks at why, we're really poorly wired to respond to something like climate change. It's this huge, overwhelming threat that historically has been really slow moving and also quite nebulous, and we're constantly hearing about it in the context of this kind of global challenge that's so far beyond our sphere of influence. And yet, we humans are wired to respond to intimate, kind of sudden attacks. Like for our ancestors, it was when a saber-toothed tiger leapt from a bush, or for me in London, when someone like swerves toward me on the pavement on a bicycle. And so, that's where we're really good at responding to threats, but we're less good and less capable when it comes to something as huge as climate change. So it's very easy to feel super small and easy to feel that you're just, one person in 7.8 billion trying to take on this problem. And it also relates this human psychology piece to this kind of optimism bias. So humans are really bad at being able to contemplate our own demise or a civilization's demise. And especially the older we get, the harder we find it to anticipate a threat. So we can, rationalize why COVID has happened, for example, why lockdown has happened. Retrospectively, but it's very difficult to actually anticipate a threat like that coming down the line because it's so far removed from our everyday existence, how we show up each day. So that is a small taster of the kind of human psychology element of why climate change is really hard to act on. There are lots of other things that go into this, like, loss aversion is another one, more afraid of losing things in the short term than we are in the long, which makes it difficult when so much of climate change is about, changing our behaviors and changing how we live every day. The second bracket, which refers to cultural narratives, we can think of as cultural values as well. So we can think of, the kind of fictions that we subscribe to en masse as a society that either encourage us toward extrinsic values or intrinsic values. So extrinsic values being all of the values that really draw us away from our own inner moral compass and toward other expectations and needs. And we can think of them by way of, the 3 C's. So consumerism, comparison, and competition. So consumerism in terms of, constantly being pushed to buy more, competition in terms of like constantly having to compete either against nature or against one another. We see that reinforced in the education system. Or comparison, where we're constantly kind of looking over our shoulders and feeling, well, I'm not really good enough because I'm not as smart as that person, or I'm not as pretty as that person. And we see how social media is such a vortex for this, right? Like, and it brings together all 3 of these negative values. So if I go on social media, if I go on Instagram and I scroll for 5 minutes, I'm seeing a very excuse me, I'm seeing very rose tinted windows into other people's lives. And I'm seeing a very glossy image of them and how they live and how they navigate the world. And in the void that is created, where I don't feel very good about myself and my own, insecurities, my own flaws, imbalances, whatever, I am then told by advertisers to, buy more and to justify my existence and feel better about myself by purchasing things that I don't actually need and don't really want either, but perhaps in attaining them, I will feel a little bit better, or I'll feel like I'm more valuable. And we see these stories echoed back at us from the advertising we're bombarded with every day through to, at times, an education system that really encourages us to become a set of averages and to, compete with our peers rather than collaborate with them, to define our sense of value, not on, which problems we want to solve, but on which careers we want to move toward, which we might not even be particularly passionate about. On the flip side of this, we can see that intrinsic values are kind of all of the opposite values. So connection, contribution, community, the things that ground us in ourselves and in service to, a mission that is bigger than any one of us. And so with that, we're now going to look at our third bucket after cultural narratives and look at kind of our personal psychology in terms of the stories that we subscribe to about the world and about our role in it. And we can think of these as our kind of inner critics or inner gremlins. And so these are the stories that emerge that keep us from realizing our potential. Stories that kind of stop us before we start because they tell us that, you know, we're not smart enough or experienced enough, that we're not, that the system is too broken, or that we're too small to make a meaningful difference. And so what I would love us to do now is actually draw attention to what some of those stories are for each and every one of us, because in boardrooms and classrooms alike, I've heard these stories on repeat, and I feel that we can't begin to shape the stories around us, the stories we subscribe to about the world, until we actually begin to shape our own personal stories. So I'm going to ask us to do a bit of an activity now, where we draw attention to some of these stories, and then we think about what we need to do to actually challenge them. So the first step in this process is to actually identify the story that keeps you feeling smallest. And we're going to take about a minute to reflect on each question in silence. So I want us first to think, you know, what is the story that keeps you feeling really small, that keeps you feeling uncertain or anxious? And examples of some of the more popular stories I've heard is that I'm not smart enough or experienced enough to solve these problems, the system is too broken to create meaningful change, or I don't know where to start. Those are 3 examples of stories. So I want you to go ahead now and reflect on what one of your own stories might be that stops you from taking action on climate. And once you're done, please go ahead and paste that in the chat. I will give us about a minute or so for this one. Okay, now we are going to look at our second question, which is to actually identify what you need to do to challenge this story. So I want you to think, you know, what's one thing that would need to happen to reveal this story for what it is, just that, a story. And I want you to frame it as a goal. So when you're thinking about this, I don't want you to think so much about you know, something that would need to happen outside of your control, but back to this idea of mobilizing our own mindsets. I want you to think about what you would need to do to actually challenge this story within yourself. And when you frame it as a goal, you could do so with a couple of examples. Something like if your story was, you know, I'm not smart enough or experienced enough to solve these problems, maybe your challenge will be to understand what skills you have to be able to create change. If your story was that the system is too broken, maybe your challenge to yourself, your goal, could be to reframe climate change as an opportunity to create a better world and focus on what solutions exist rather than giving all of your energy to the problems. Finally, if your story is that you don't know where to start, maybe your challenge to yourself could look something like find the focus of a single problem rather than feel overwhelmed by the scale of climate change. So we're going to take another minute now to reflect on one thing that you could do in terms of a goal to actually challenge that story and challenge that fiction. So we just had one example come through in terms of a story that keeps you feeling small, which is that sometimes it feels like only a few of my peers are interested in care. Completely understand that, and it's really alienating as well when you feel like you're the only person who's kind of fighting the fight. And one thing that I would suggest in terms of a goal is to both find people within your community and in other places where community coalesces, so online, for example, to find peers who are your own age who do care just as deeply about these issues so that you can connect around the problems and the solutions. Every week at Force of Nature, we conduct anxiety to agency classrooms with students from literally every corner of the world, from New York to Jakarta, Tel Aviv to Nicaragua, all of whom between the ages of 14 through 24 are super passionate about climate change and wanting to take action on the issue. So there are lots of communities that do exist, including our own, if you want to get in touch, that will support you to find people who are like-minded and care about the same stuff. Cool. And then great to see some of the challenges coming in as well. So I'll have more conversations with friends about climate change, practice presenting so I can talk to others on the topic. That's really, really brilliant ideas. I'm not sure what your stories were, but I can see how beneficial both of those things were. And just talking and playing to your strengths is a really great way of building up some of that confidence to be able to speak articulately to these issues. Equally, I think there's a lot of pressure on young people to have all of the answers when it comes to climate change, but it can actually be very empowering to embrace what you don't know. So continue to ask lots of questions, speak to what you do know to be true, so arm yourself with some of the facts. But then it's also okay to put your hand up and say, well, I don't know, but let's find out together. Great. So that has drawn a close to the end of our session, but I really encourage each and every one of you to continue this exploration of your stories and the goals that you're setting for yourself to really challenge them. And as you go forward with the rest of the summit, I would encourage you as well to really commit these to a particular time sensitive kind of commitment as well. So you're thinking, well, what would the first step look like if I want to speak to friends or if I want to present, and how could I do that either by the end of the day or by the end of this summit, so that you're also holding yourself accountable to changing your own self narrative and changing your own action. So that draws a conclusion to today, but thank you so much for joining, and very much looking forward to seeing more of you for tomorrow's session, which is Everyone's an Activist, which will be a 40-minute deep dive into more of what we've touched on today. All right, thanks very much, guys. Bye.